Hey there everybody, Gaia Ghost here, bringing you another Dead Cells video, and today I wanted to look at some of the best Brutality builds in version 2.5. First up here, an old favorite of mine, the Slip and Slide build. It recently got a slight nerf to its damage output, but it's still very much at the top of the food chain. And the idea here is to pair the Meat Skewer's Slide with the Assault Shield Parry or Phaser. Maybe Light Speed if you're really good with it, but I don't usually go that route. So, by combining these movesets, we're able to attack whilst evading very consistently. And it can really turn the tables in situations where you would likely otherwise be taking some pretty heavy damage. And combining Killer Instinct with Lacerating Aura in Biomes is pretty busted, because Lacerating Aura only has a 12-second cooldown. Its cooldown starts as you're using it. Killer Instinct gets 3 seconds subtracted from that per kill. So you'll only need to take out 2 enemies with the Skewer, and then you can break it out again pretty much instantaneously. One downside to this build is that you'll sometimes find yourself sliding into damage, but the more you play with it, the less that'll happen, and soon enough you'll be taking out enemies left, right, and center. Now, in terms of mutations, for Biomes, I would definitely go Predator, especially early on, as even 1 second of invisibility will still stop everything around you momentarily, and really helps you just breeze through the biomes with a melee build. And then the third one, kinda up in the air, Frenzy, Open Wounds, maybe Masochist in a trap heavy level, kinda up to preference and playstyle. And for bosses, I would swap out Killer Instinct for Master at Arms, and prioritize Open Wounds and Melee. Vengeance is also a pretty good option there, but of course if you're going for the no-hit, well, that's no good. Serenade might seem like a strange pairing for this, and it is, but it allows you to get in some stationary melee hits, usually with heavy criticals built up, can be kept out indefinitely, and takes out pesky flying enemies when your Lacerating Aura might be down. But one really interesting thing about it is that it can generate a shield when used, and you can continually swap it out as much as you want, allowing you to stay pretty well protected in situations that would otherwise probably mean your death. Alright, so I'm probably going to get some hate if I don't at least point out that Scheme combined with the Phaser version of this build is a very good pairing. However, if you're scrolled up half decently and your equipment is the appropriate level, I really don't think that you'll need the damage buff. You should be taking out enemies just fine without it, and maybe leave it open for something else. That being said, it is still a very viable option. And as you can see here, the build is pretty cool under pressure, even when you're not. Has surprisingly good rally back potential for such a fast-hitting weapon. Also makes for some pretty easy kill streaks, even in some of the tougher biomes. Especially in biomes like Undying Shores here, Fractured Shrines, or Ramparts, where you can bully enemies off the ledge, it very much excels. And whatever this build might lack in damage, it definitely makes up for with how fun it is to play with. Okay, so I usually hate doing stuff like this, but according to YouTube, less than 1% of our viewership here is subscribed. So if you are enjoying this kind of content and you'd like to see more of it, consider subscribing. It helps the channel more than you could know. And with that out of the way, let's get down to some boss fights. So this moveset, very good for attacking whilst evading, matches up with multiple boss movesets, as long as you can keep the rhythm going, and just makes for some pretty entertaining fights in general. Assault Shield Parry combined with a dodge roll covers a pretty huge distance, but it won't actually parry attacks, and you'll be left open for a moment afterwards, so be cautious when using that maneuver. And even though DPS isn't the main feature of this build, it can still chunk quite a lot of health away pretty quickly. And if you get into panicky situations, you can just go meet Skewer phase, Assault Shield Parry, dodge roll, rinse and repeat, and remain safe for just about anything. With the exception of that, of course, being slammers and demolishers, or anything with a shockwave attack. Seems like a good point to mention that combo is actually a pretty great mutation for boss fights like Hand of the King because he summons elites, or Conjunctivius or the Giant because you kill the tentacles in the hands throughout the fight. I think this goes overlooked a lot of the time because it's generally seen as a biome mutation. And of course, this is also pretty good against the spoiler boss, who I will be featuring with all of these builds for those of you that want to see it, but I'm going to put all of those at the end just so that those of you who don't want to get spoiled can still enjoy this video. And while No Mercy probably isn't the greatest mutation for boss fights, their final phase is always the hardest, and it does make for a very short final phase. So if that's something you struggle with, it's definitely something to consider. Now, this one's another classic, and I'm not going to get into as deep of a dive with it because the build is pretty similar to the last one. This is sort of a variation on that. Instead of going with slip and slide, we go for a backstab build. A little less chaotic. Definitely focuses much more on single targets. Now, I know that this combination famously goes to the Sadist Stiletto and Open Wounds, but after the recent update, I really don't think the damage numbers add up, even though the Stiletto's a bit faster. You could just go for plus 60 damage to bleeding targets on the Assassin's Dagger, or you could just omit the whole bleeding aspect together and then get something like Frenzy instead of Open Wounds, and you won't really be short on damage. But for all you stiletto lovers out there, don't worry, that's going to be making an appearance very soon. I would recommend always bringing the Scheme mutation to a boss fight with this build, but it's another situation where I don't really think it's necessary in biomes. Even most elites are just going to be 1 or 2 shots with it, so it's very much not necessary. And what I like to do in conjunction with the first build is keep the dagger in the backpack, and if I'm entering a biome where maybe I don't want to be slipping around all over the place, I swap into this one, and by doing so you pretty much have an answer for every situation. So, Phaser allows us to keep positioning for the Assassin's Dagger, obviously, but by pairing it with Master at Arms, even though Phaser only has a 2-second cooldown, getting those virtually instantaneous repeated phasers is actually pretty huge. Not to mention the cooldown you'll get on your other ability. The one downside, as you can see what just happened there, is sometimes phaser will just target an enemy of its own choosing, in that case the Invincible Hand of the King. So that is one thing to be mindful of. Up at number 3, but what might quite possibly be number 1, status and burst damage. What I mean by that is, of course, inflicting as many status afflictions as possible, and using weapons that, instead of having one kind of straight button mash combo, have a sort of burst damage. Mainly being the War Spear, Rapier, and sort of Sadist Stiletto. And the main reasoning behind this is, on higher cell difficulties, as enemies get stronger, have more health, are faster, and there's more of them, you'll have fewer and fewer clean attack opportunities, and this really helps you capitalize on those. And my biome mutations are pretty similar, but I would definitely recommend prioritizing open wounds for this one. It of course fits with the theme. Once again, I would probably place the War Spear and Rapier above the Stiletto. The War Spear just has much better range, its damage is significantly higher, and same with the Rapier. Even though they require some more positioning, you're going to have to be positioning anyway once you get to higher difficulties, so it kind of just works out. For abilities, I would pretty much always go for skills and powers over grenades and traps. They just have a much better likelihood of having a lot of status afflicting affixes on them, and you'll just be able to trigger whatever synergies you have available pretty much all the time. Quick side note, I know the Porcupack gets a lot of hate and it's not particularly great, but I think people really ignore how it takes on the effect of whatever weapon is equipped in it and not just the damage. So when combined with something like the Shovel or Spartan Sandals, it actually does become a viable option for sort of a placeholder mutation. Something to consider. For your secondary weapon slot, I would recommend either Frontline or Blood Shield for damage buff or status infliction, or Throwing Knife if you're confident enough to play with that. In my experience, it's been better to take out the smaller flying enemies with your abilities and keep a parry option, but that just might be my playstyle. One more thing that sets the War Spear apart from a lot of other Brutality options is that since it scales with survival, it can also get the slows down nearby enemies affix on kills, which can really help with its slow wind-up time, and is just one more thing that you can synergize with. And in terms of boss mutations for this build, there's of course open wounds in melee, but I would also stress Mastered Arms even harder than the last two builds, as the Stiletto and the Rapier are capable of getting a lot of criticals very quickly, if you attack in the right direction, unlike myself right there. And if you do decide to go with the parry option, an off-color Blind Faith can still reduce your skill cooldowns by about 3 seconds with a melee parry. So not a terrible boss option. Another placeholder mutation that I think goes overlooked a lot of the time. Up at number 4.
Fire and blood!
A lot of you are probably asking, why is he featuring a build that obviously belongs in Tactics? But Serenade really makes for a viable Brutality version of this, as it inflicts oil possibly better than any other ability in the game, oil grenade included, without any need for a cooldown mutation. But what makes this build really unique is it's the only one that allows you to have a ranged weapon, a melee weapon, and a shield available in your weapon slots. I wouldn't really count shrapnel axes because the projectiles don't travel very far, their damage is pretty pitiful, and of course you have to be melee attacking in order to use them. This way really opens up your movesets in a way that I don't think any other build really does. I'd prioritize No Mercy on this build, as Pyrotechnics has that 3-hit combo and you really want to finish off enemies before it's over. Otherwise you're left open and it's pretty likely you'll take a hit. No Mercy really helps keep this consistent. And while Point Blank is off color for this, its damage buff starts at plus 40% and gains plus 1% for every tactics scroll you pick up. So even if you just prioritize it a little bit more than survival, you can get up to a near 50% damage increase on close targets. Certainly nothing to scoff at. Third Biome mutation is kind of up in the air. Tranquility doesn't scale up as well as Point Blank does, but it's definitely an option. Stuff like Combo. And if you're competent at weaving in kills with Serenade, you could go Killer Instinct or other melee-based mutations, but I wouldn't really suggest it. Another thing I really like about this build is that it excels in places that other Brutality builds generally don't. Especially with virtually every ranged option being moved to Tactics, this might be one of the only good Brutality options left. So if you wanted to go somewhere that's pretty biased towards Tactics or ranged builds, like say the Arboretum, the Giant Fight, or here in the Distillery, this is most certainly your best option, and you can always switch back into a melee build afterward. For abilities, you're going to want to get a bleed source and get plus damage to bleeding targets on your Pyrotechnics or Fire Blast, and then ideally plus 100 damage to targets covered in burning oil on your bleed source. And finally, if you can get another synergy on top of that, your damage on bosses will be absolutely busted. Of course, going for a poison source and synergizing with that is great as well. It's actually a bigger damage boost. I just find it's much less reliable. There's more good bleeding options in the game, especially for Brutality. So here at this Giant Fight, I have a pretty pitiful 25 scroll count, which is not great for 5 BC, and I stupidly bring the Sinew Slicer, which barely hits him at all, and it still just melts through his health bar. Okay, well, clearly the legendary punishment is helping in this fight, but you get the idea. Also, if you put something like a throwing knife or a bow that poisons enemies on hit in the Acrobata pack, it might not deal major damage where it's off color, but it can definitely help pull off even more synergies. Now, I have the ×2 damage affix on right now, but that also just seems like an incredibly common one for this weapon, almost like it's meant to be used for a glass cannon build. But basically, whenever I pick up one that doesn't have it, I re-roll it once and it gets it. So, even with a low scroll count and no legendaries, he's still dead before he can get an attack off in his last phase. And I know I'm a broken record with this one, but I do want you to pay attention to the cooldown effect you get off Master at Arms with this build. So as long as you can get in hits for 2 to 3 seconds, you should be able to keep the boss perpetually bleeding or poisoned. Okay, so the video is about to enter spoiler territory, and for anyone who might be tuning out because of that, thank you so much for watching. I hope you found this video helpful, and if you didn't find it helpful, feel free to let me know in the comments below. I always welcome constructive criticism. Okay, are you ready for this one? Watch closely, because I can guarantee you're not going to see this first one coming.
Hesitation is defeat. I told you that, didn't I?
The Assault Shield seems to affect the Collector in a unique way. All other shields will just end the Syringe spin attack with a parry, which is almost certainly better, but the Assault Shield will cancel most of his attacks if you parry a little prematurely, making it pretty easy to maintain pressure, plus it makes for easy parries on his charge and shockwave attacks. He frequently leaves himself open for backstabs, usually before and after healing or before and after the slam attack. And finally, Phaser cancels the beam attack. You put a good DPS ability on top of all that, and you've got one of the best builds for no-hitting the Collector. Predator just about trivializing the Astrolab. Just bring something like Lacerating Aura or Knife Dance, as I mentioned before, to take care of those pesky flying mage enemies. They're the worst and everybody knows it. Now, you may want to take your Rapier or Stiletto out for this biome instead of the War Spear, as enemies aren't terribly densely populated throughout most of it. However, the slows down enemies on kill affix is pretty useful in here. Frontline shield, very good in this fight as there's plenty of parry opportunities. And ideally you want to combine that with a corrupted power. If you combine the two, you can get some pretty serious damage output. Right here I've only got the Corrosive Cloud, but his health is still just melting away. I'm using combo on most of these, and the reason is sometimes he'll summon these enemies before you get in a whole lot of damage. And combo basically ensures that when he leaves himself vulnerable here, you'll deal enough to either skip the ranged phase entirely, or at least guarantee you a fairly short one. But Vengeance for a near 100% damage increase when you get hurt, or Melee to keep him slowed if you can handle the changing of his attack timings, are probably the other two safe options here. just getting ignorant with this one. As I said before, whatever points it might lose in terms of practicality, it makes up for in fun. So, in some of those first fights, my scroll count was up a little bit higher, around 35. But in these next two clips, I'm going to keep it down at 30. And as you'll see, these builds are still more than capable of taking him on, even with the heavily reduced damage and no legendaries. Although with this range build, if you did prioritize tactics over survival scrolls, you're going to have fairly low health. So, once again, glass cannon build, basically its only real downside. Alright, my dudes and dudettes, that's basically it. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video and found it helpful, like and subscribe for more Dead Cells content. And as always, break the game, not your controller.